Hi, it's Leanne from Studio LP Ceramics, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I make ceramic pumpkins on the potter's wheel. I'll give you some of my tips and tricks to make your own quirky pumpkins full of character. I'm using 1 kilogram of reclaimed clay on these. I have reclaim right now that is a mix of all my stoneware clays from when I have either been too lazy or I haven't had space to separate all my reclaim out. So while I've been testing new stoneware clays, I've just mixed them all up and I will use it on non-functional work like these pumpkins, and then I'll use it on Christmas trees next. It just means I don't really have to worry about thermal shock or vitrification issues like I would if it went into mugs. I tend to be okay making my pumpkins all a little bit different shapes, but I do like to measure the base as that's what's going to support the height of the cylinder we're going to throw in a minute. You can experiment with making the base wider for a more short and squat pumpkin, but in this example, I'm going to open the base to 10 centimeters wide. That's about 4 inches. Okay, from here I'm going to pull into a thick-walled cylinder. We're just focusing on the height and the clay distribution for the first 3 pulls into an even cylinder. We're not worrying too much about the pumpkin shape yet. My tip for keeping this much clay straight and not flaring is for every pull to focus on trying to get that outside hand into the middle of the pot. So the outside hand is pushing in to try and make a volcano shape. Now, this isn't really like a mug where you want walls to be thin and light. You actually want this to be a decent thickness because of how we're going to shape the pumpkin into a rounded form, which means you need enough clay to stretch into those curves. And later, when we indent into the lobes of the pumpkin, it needs to be stable enough to not crack or split. It needs to be able to stretch into those. So I throw this 1 kilo of clay to about 16 centimeters. I think it's about 6 inches tall before I start shaping and coloring it. This is the pull where I start curving the clay out to start the pumpkin form. I do this over a few pulls, so it's a gentle bellying out. Right now though, I'm focused on the middle of the pot, getting that shoulder curve inwards. If you do the bottom of the pot first, the pot is more likely to lose structure and it sort of flops or folds in on itself when you're messing about pushing the curved belly out. I'm also going to leave the top of the pot straight. This is what we'll use to close the form up, so don't worry about it right now. Just keep it wide enough to fit your hand in. I'm just pushing out gently from the inside hand into my outside hand into that curve. If you feel more comfortable, you can use a rib for this. You can use a wood, a rigid rubber one, or here I'm using the flat side of my profile ribs. I'm just following up the side of the pot to remove the throwing lines and help me stretch that curve. You can also see how much slip it's removing. If you want to use a Mud Tools rubber rib, I like the green one for this. And in this angle, you can kind of see how I've kept the collar at the top of the pot on this one a bit wider. Okay, an important step though that gets lost in filming and editing is keep removing water from the inside of the pot with a sponge on a stick. Now I have my top curve, I'm going to get the base of the pumpkin sorted. My trick is to use a curved profile rib. This is one I designed and sell, and I have a previous video on how to use the profile ribs. But essentially, you hold it in place and push the clay with your inside hand into the rib. I'm using rib A, which is like an egg shape. It gives me a lovely undercut that makes it look like the pumpkin is sitting proud instead of glued to the bat. Now the tricky part, let's close this form up. Using collaring techniques, close your first finger and thumb of both hands around the top quarter of the pot. The wheel should be spinning pretty fast here, as you want the wheel to be doing the work. The centrifugal force is what helps, and your fingers and thumb are directing the clay inwards. I find when I'm closing a form like this, I often use my right thumb to push from 6 o'clock to 12 o'clock, and that's what's pushing it closed. And then after each pass to close the top, I go back to the top shoulder of the curve and I thin the clay by doing a wall pull-up. It's kind of a dance between squeezing it closed and then pulling until the wall meets. And on some pulls, I have to use my middle finger as my knuckles don't fit. Also notice I'm not putting too much water on the inside of the pot, only on the outside, and I'm making sure my fingers are wet with slip. Too much water will cause issues with drying. Here I'm using a rib to smooth where I had the slip. When it gets small enough that my fingers and thumbs don't fit around it, I use the first 4 fingertips to squeeze it together. Collaring in like this can give you a little shoulder on the pot you don't want, so keep dancing between thinning the walls and squeezing the opening closed. When it meets, it can go a little bit uneven or create a little nub, but don't worry, we can sort that. You just want to keep squeezing it closed until the sides close in, and then compress so you have a really good join there. So I'll just squeeze that closed, and now you have an airtight form. Now it's airtight, it'll hold its structure and you can really refine that pumpkin shape. But first, let's remove all the slip. I use the back of a profile rib. Then I turn the curve upside down to refine the top curve of the pumpkin, as I've already done the bottom. This one is kind of like a teacup that flares out, but the curve helps me go from this balloon shape to a nice like heritage Cinderella type pumpkin shape. When it's full of air, it holds its shape nicely and you can really refine the curve, but be careful not to press too hard because it could explode. Here's a quick view from the side, so if you end up with that little nub, just trim it with a needle tool and then smooth it down with a rib. And here's your wheel thrown closed form. I like that the rib undercuts the pumpkin, lifting it, and it gives it this squarish look. So it's a bit flatter on top with a curve. I'll show you how this helps with forming, but right now I'm going to leave this to dry until it loses its stickiness. Don't leave to leather hard, it needs to be soft enough to form. Once the pot isn't too sticky to touch, I'm ready to form. So to help me form the indents, I use the dowel end of a sponge on a stick, a large fan paintbrush, and actually a tile from my bat system. I'll use the corner of it though. I'm going to start using the end of the paintbrush. I'm going to mark out the lobes. I like them to be a bit irregular and not exactly opposite each other. I think it makes it look more quirky and realistic. You can see how the pumpkin is airtight, so it's like a balloon when you indent it. If you find you do push too hard and it breaks the seal at the top, just smooth it with your finger or add a little disc of clay on top. Now I use the sponge and a stick for longer indents. It's quite a messy stage and it does take a while for the vision to come to life, so stick with me. No pun intended. I did kind of make a mistake there. You can see that I didn't put the dowel like far enough down to the bat, so it made an indent, but it's easy to fix later. So I go all the way around with that thicker dowel from the sponge tool, and then I switch back to the thinner paintbrush to further refine them. I focus on the top corner of the pumpkin with the thinner dowel and sort of push down so it makes lobes into each segment sit proud. Now using a needle tool, I'm going to create a tiny hole to release some air so you can further form the top. I just kind of push it in a little so that it indents further down. That's where the stem's going to go. Now I use a tile to push into the crevices I made and it sort of gives a nice V shape, but it just doesn't really show up on the screen very well, so you'll have to trust me. Pumpkin's been firming up overnight and it's now leather hard. Still attached to the bat though, and it hasn't popped off. Still a bit messy, but now that they hold their shape, I can kind of refine it and clean it up before I add the stems. I'm going to pull the stems, so first I'll start with making a pulling blank. I have about 200 grams of clay here and I formed it into a sausage. I then throw the clay at an angle to help it into a cone wedge shape. I want one end to be a bit smaller than the other, and because clay doesn't really roll very well, it sort of squares off. I find throwing it at this angle is the easiest way to quickly form it into this conical shape. I won't focus too much on pulling as it's a whole lesson in itself, but let me know in the comments if you'd like a specific video on pulling handles. I'm pulling it with my fingers in this shape. It's a little bit different than pulling a mug handle, which I personally like a flatter profile. I'm trying to get a circular profile, so I keep turning the clay 90 degrees here. So I turn it and then pull. And I'm squeezing my fingers together like this to create the length. Keep pulling consistently all the way down to the end of the blank. I'm now going to use my thumb to sort of give some detail like a pumpkin stem has. It's not smooth, you sort of see these ridges on it. So just spin it around and give those details with your thumb. When it's as long as you like, you can cut it. Keep one end nice and thick. A stem starts really wide at the pumpkin base, so cut it quite far back into the blank. You can see here that's a fair bit thicker than a handle would normally be. I've left these now to firm up into a movable but not tacky stage, and I'm going to add some more details with my fingers. And then I am just going to twist them and kind of just have fun with this. I probably faff with these a little bit more than I should though. To attach them, it's just like a mug. Slip and score the middle, score the stem, and push them together for a firm attachment. And then faff loads more trying to get the twist right. Once the pumpkin has dried for a little while, they'll naturally pop off the bats. It's part of the magic of the Hartley and Noble system that I use. I don't wire them off, but what I do now is just tidy up the base. This tool is called a Sureform or a clay rasp, and I'm just going to use it to kind of shave off the corners. It kind of looks like a cheese grater, and I just refine the bottom of the pumpkin with it. The bottom is still in the messy stage, and we're going to clean it up and extend these lobes down. I'm going to use this small trimming loop tool and just carve the limes all the way down. This is why the pot itself is good to be a bit on the thicker side. So it's been at a messy stage for a while now, and this is when you can start to refine it a bit, but I'll be honest, while making and filming at different angles meant I wasn't as refined all the way through as I'd like to normally be. So there's a bit more cleanup required, but it's easily done at this stage. I also broke both stems, so be careful when you're cleaning it up. I think I left my pumpkins a little too far into the greenware cheesy stage instead of the leather hard stage. I'm stamping the bottom and then I'm going to cut a hole in it. The hole is to let steam escape in the kiln, and controversially I don't always do this because if you ensure your pumpkin is completely dry, then there's no water that needs to turn into steam and escape. But it is best practice, and it's probably good to do if you're new to making them so you don't end up with an exploded pumpkin. And I didn't do it here, but you should probably hold the pumpkin facing so the bottom is facing down when you're cutting the hole, so any pieces of clay fall out of the hole. Here, this is what I realized. And they aren't pushed back in. Otherwise, you end up with little pieces of clay inside the pumpkin, and it's kind of like a bell. So now I just have to leave this one to thoroughly dry before going to the kiln. And here are some I have already pulled out of the bisque kiln and are ready for glazing. If you do have a go at making your own whimsical, quirky pumpkin from this tutorial, I would really love to see it. You can find me over at Instagram at Studio LP Ceramics, or drop me a comment below. And I'd love to see you as a new subscriber if you found my videos helpful. Thanks so much for being here. Bye!